The following program is brought to you in living color on NBC.
This is Lawrence Spivak inviting you to Meet the Press.
Meet the Press, now celebrating its 24th year on television and winner of every major award in its field, is a public affairs presentation of NBC News. Meet the Press is brought to you by Allstate Insurance Companies. For insurance to protect your car, your home, your life, health, and business too. Talk to the good hands people.
Our guests today on Meet the Press are two leaders of Vietnam veterans against the war. Al Hubbard, a former Air Force captain, and John Kerry, a former Navy lieutenant, JG. Their organization begins a 5-day anti-war demonstration in Washington tomorrow. Both men were decorated and injured in Vietnam. Mr. Hubbard attended the University of Washington, served 12 years in the Air Force, and was a pilot. Mr. Kerry spent 3.5 years in the Navy after graduation from Yale University and is now in the reserves. I'd like to start the questions with Mr. Hubbard. Mr. Hubbard, you were in the Air Force for 12 years, and you served, I believe, for 2 years in Vietnam. When and why did you decide that your country is wrong to fight in Vietnam?
Well, I think I was fully aware before I went to Vietnam that our country was wrong in what it was doing. I thought while I was in Vietnam that I would be able to come to grips with that, and I found that I couldn't, that I rationalized as a result of my 12 years in the service that our military forces were needed all over the world, and I thought maybe I did not have the full picture of what was going on in Vietnam. So it was not until after I came back that I started actively dealing with my problems in relating to that.
Well, Mr. Hubbard, why do you think your judgment about the war is better than the judgment of 3 presidents who believe we're right in entering the war and their military advisors?
Because, first of all, it's not my judgment. It is the collective knowledge of the Vietnam veterans that I have to call upon. 12,000 members who can present all of the various pieces of the puzzle so that I may collectively, with the membership, sit down and pull this puzzle together and look at precisely what is going on and what this country is doing.
Mr. Kerry, are you opposed just to the war in Vietnam, or are you opposed to all wars?
I would like to be opposed to all wars. Unfortunately, I don't think we are in a position as a nation or as a world at this moment to be. But I don't really think that's the issue. I think the question is really the opposition to this war and why we are opposing this war at this time and what we have to say here in Washington in the next week.
Well, now, one of your organization's advertisement says, and I quote, "We believe that the Vietnam War is a civil war, a war in which the United States has no right or obligation to intervene." What do you base your belief that the war is a civil war and not aggression from the North, as so many American leaders have said? No, that's for you, Mr. Kerry.
I'm sorry. I base that on my experience in fighting with the South Vietnamese, the kinds of things that I saw on a day-to-day basis in South Vietnam, as well as on the historical writings of most of the distinguished scholars in this country. Clearly, if you follow the pattern of North Vietnamese escalation in Vietnam, it follows a direct pattern along with our escalation. Clearly, you can see from when we entered the war at the end, when the French pulled out, that we entered it with a very flimsy excuse under the Citeaux Treaty, which was a creation of John Foster Dulles so that the United States could combat the so-called communist monolith. Clearly, as you fight with the Vietnamese, you become aware of the fact that this is a war of the people, because without it, guerrillas cannot exist. It's impossible to wage guerrilla warfare against the largest air power in the history of warfare without the support of people to hide and harbor and supply you.
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll be back to introduce our panel and continue the questions on Meet the Press in just a minute, but first this message.
is our business. We're Standard Oil Company, New Jersey. Our affiliates search the world for oil and refine it into thousands of products. Oil is your business, too. The world we know couldn't run without it.
Now, back to Meet the Press, an unrehearsed press conference. Here's our moderator, Lawrence Spivak.
Resuming our interview on Meet the Press, our guests today are two leaders of Vietnam veterans against the war, Al Hubbard and John Kerry. On our panel of questioners today are Robert Goralski of NBC News, Peter Lissagore of the Chicago Daily News, Neil Sheehan of the New York Times, and Crosby Noyes of the Washington Evening Star. We'll continue the questions with Mr. Goralski.
Well, Mr. Hubbard, knowing your anti-war position, how do you propose we get out of Vietnam? Just an immediate withdrawal? Is that your solution?
Yes, I think immediate, unconditional, unilateral withdrawal of all of our troops, but we must go beyond that. We must withdraw our technology and our air support because we can still continue to wage that war without utilizing any ground combat forces.
What do you think will happen in Indochina if U.S. forces are withdrawn completely?
Well, I would imagine that the Indo-Chinese people would then have an opportunity to determine for themselves what type government they will have and will be able to deal realistically with their own domestic problems.
Well, Mr. Hubbard, how do you respond to the administration's contention that until there is a release of the prisoners of war held by North Vietnam, that it would be unwise to pull out American troops?
Well, first of all, I feel that that's a position that I can't understand. I think that it's obvious to me and to all of the Vietnam veterans that I've talked to that the only way to protect our prisoners of war in the North is to stop our fighting in the South, to stop our bombing of the North, and that they will be released. And we have no guarantees that some people are not going to be hurt. Unfortunately, I would like to have that guarantee, but the president doesn't have any guarantees that he can preclude their being hurt by our presence there, by our continued presence. So I say we stop it and we take that chance. I'm sure that all of those POWs will be released, as the PRG has indicated, without harm.
Mr. Lissagore.
Mr. Kerry, President Nixon has said that Vietnamization has succeeded. You're quoted in an interview this morning as saying Vietnamization is not working and that the administration is frightened by what you may tell the people about it. Is the president misinformed or deceived in saying that the Vietnamization has succeeded?
Well, I can't say whether he's misinformed or otherwise. I know for a fact that in many instances in South Vietnam, the reports which are given from the field and are often changed en route to the upper levels. We have a tendency here in this country, and particularly in the military in Vietnam, to see what we want to see and to report what we want to report. And I believe that Vietnamization, you really can't consider it a success. Not when you look at the way they came out of Laos recently on the skids of helicopters. Not if you read the reports of the reporters who were there. I think that even if it were a success, we still have no business being there. And that's the important point. We don't have to consider whether or not this war is winding down. Because if it is, it's only winding down for Americans. And that's not a solution. We don't have to consider whether or not Vietnamization is in fact a success, because whether or not it is, it merely means the continuation of a war for peoples in another country. It means that the United States is then accepting the responsibility for those South Vietnamese who will be dying for years to come because we've told them that they can fight.
What do you think the United States can do about the war once it has ended its own involvement in it? How does the President of the United States end the war for the Vietnamese, the war in Laos, the war in Cambodia?
Well, I think it's very, very clear how the President of the United States can end this war. I was recently in Paris, and I talked on behalf of Vietnam Veterans Against the War with both delegations to the peace talks from the North and the NLF. And as Senator Vance Hartke said when he came back, and others have stated many times, The moment we set a date for withdrawal from South Vietnam, we will negotiate the return of prisoners, and our troops will be permitted to return to this country without one shot being fired on them. And time and again, Madam Bin reiterates that this is one of 2 important points of her 8 points, the only 2 that are non-negotiable. The other is that we let the Vietnamese decide their own future.
Mr. Sheehan.
Well, Mr. Kerry, I'd like to follow that up, if I might, a little bit. And that is that one of the common criticisms of demonstrations such as you and Mr. Hubbard are organizing is that they cause dissension at a time when we really ought to have unity in this country. So what do you have to say to the contention that the President is, in fact, winding down the war, that he's withdrawing another 100,000 troops by the end of this year, and that the kind of thing that you and Mr. Hubbard are doing is simply making things harder for him to get us out of? It's making it more difficult for the President to get the country out of Vietnam rather than facilitating an American withdrawal.
Want to try that first, Mr. Hubbard?
Yes, well, first of all, I'd like to say that in the winding down, the one thing that this administration has not done is to remove combat troops. Now, we're playing a clever game over there. We're removing people, yes. But I think the figures that we've gotten is somewhere in the neighborhood of 80,000 troops directly involved in the combat. I haven't seen any decline in that figure. I don't think the war is being wound down as a result of the administration's withdrawal of troops. I think it's being wound down as a result of the grunt, the infantrymen, refusing to make contact. And as a result, we're utilizing our technology. We have sensors implanted in the jungle that feed back information to MACV headquarters that can't differentiate between combatants and non-combatants, cannot differentiate between human beings and animals. But because our troops are not making contact and because we're given the illusion of wind down, we send out an airstrike on the basis of this information. We're still killing people. We're killing them at the same rate. We're changing the color of the bodies maybe on the battlefield, but we are not winding down the war, and that's a myth that must be destroyed.
So your contention, in other words, is that really that the war is going on and the President is not getting the country out of there.
That's precisely
right.
Well,
let me follow on to one other question, if I may, that's related to the work you and Mr. Kerry are doing. You mentioned representing 12,000 veterans of the Vietnam War who supposedly sympathize with you. What about a lot of other veterans of the Vietnam War who may be opposed to what you're doing? Aren't there a lot of veterans who don't like what you're doing, who feel that you people may be betraying whatever sacrifice they've made in Vietnam by asking for an American withdrawal?
Well, I can only speak on the basis of my exposure to veterans in this country. I have not seen a significant number of veterans who are opposed to us. I have noted that with 12,000 members, that's a very small percentage of the total number of returned Vietnam veterans. But I've noted that Vietnam veterans or veterans of the Vietnam era do not relate to organizations. They don't join any organization. However, they do, for every member we have on the rolls, we have 3 to 5 Vietnam veterans who are not members that will relate to the activities of the organization and support us. I don't know that there is any significant number of veterans that support the war in Vietnam. Those people usually remain in the military and are still on active duty.
Mr. Noyes.
Mr. Kerry, you said at one time or another that you think that our policies in Vietnam are tantamount to genocide and that the responsibility lies at all chains of command over there. Do you consider that you, personally, as a naval officer, committed atrocities in Vietnam or crimes punishable by law in this country?
There are all kinds of atrocities, and I would have to say that yes, I committed the same kind of atrocities as thousands of other soldiers have committed, in that I took part in shootings in free fire zones. I conducted harassment and interdiction fire. I used 50 caliber machine guns, which we were ordered to use, which were our only weapon against people. I took part in search and destroy missions, in the burning of villages. All of this is contrary to the laws of warfare. All of this is contrary to the Geneva Conventions. And all of this is ordered as a matter of written, established policy by the government of the United States from the top down. And I believe that the men who designed these, the men who designed a free fire zone, the men who ordered us, the men who signed off the air raid strike areas, I think these men, by the letter of the law, the same letter of the law that tried Lieutenant Calley, are war criminals.
Well, have you ever refused to obey an order that's been given you on the grounds that it was illegal or that they were asking you to commit a crime that you knew was a crime at the time?
Yes, Mr. Noyes, I have, and we did. And we did this to a large degree when we were in Vietnam. We fought the policy very hard. We fought it so hard, as a matter of fact, that at one point to try and quell the dissension in our group, or at least explain to us that what we were doing was good, my division of 21 officers and the division of officers on the other side of the Delta was flown to Saigon, where we were briefed in person by the Admiral in command of Naval Forces, now Chief of Naval Operations, where we were briefed by the General in command of forces in Vietnam, General Creighton Abrams, where we were told that we were writing naval legends, and where we were told that we should continue because we were showing the American flag, not the Vietnamese, but the American flag, and because we were, in fact, proving to the Viet Cong that they didn't own the rivers.
Mr. Lissagore.
Mr. Hubbard, if, as Mr. Kerry said, he committed atrocities in Vietnam, as Lieutenant William Calley did, do you feel that Lieutenant Calley was guilty?
Yes, I don't think that Mr. Kerry said he committed atrocities, as did Lieutenant William Calley. There is a difference. There's a difference in an individual giving an order after having identified non-combatants, giving an order to kill. I know that many of the platoon leaders and company commanders that I've talked to were vehemently opposed to the free fire zone policy. But you must understand it's a survival situation, and any officer who feels that he can save the life of one of his men by issuing an order to recon by fire if he has not seen women and children, I think then cannot be considered responsible for that policy. But if he then, after identifying non-combatants, issues an order to shoot those non-combatants, then he is guilty of an aberration on his part, something that is beyond the policy, you see.
Yet many of the Vietnam veterans insist that My Lai was not an aberration, that it was rather common, only in a smaller dimension. Do you believe that to be true?
I believe that many My Lais occur every day. I think My Lai was unique only in that there was more people killed by one platoon in one place at one time, and it was made public. I think there was one difference. I think that you do not find the average Army officer ordering his men to kill women and children. You do not find that. I think that was the difference. I think Lieutenant Calley was unique. He is not a representative of the officers in the military.
Mr. Goralski.
Mr. Kerry, I'd like to ask you just what you attempt to achieve this week. There have been an awful lot of anti-war demonstrations in this capital, a lot of moratoriums. Are there any uncommitteds left at this point that you can reach with what you plan this week?
Yes, there are. But it's not a question of reaching the uncommitted. We are down here to demand that those who call themselves the most committed of all in this country, namely the senators and congressmen who've been talking peace for the past few years, that these men exercise their responsibility granted them by the Constitution of this country to end this war. And that is what we are here to demand. And we're here to demand it because we are the men who have seen what is happening in Southeast Asia. And we believe that there is no reason and no excuse and no justification for the loss of one more American life there or for the loss of more Vietnamese. This war can be ended, and it should be ended now, and that is what we're here to say. We're here to say it, and we bring a new kind of uniqueness in that we are the first veterans of any war while that war is going on to come back and say no to that war.
Mr. Noyes.
Mr. Hubbard, what would you advise a young man to do today who's called for military service?
Well, I would advise him to really question himself. I did not say that I would not go to Vietnam and I elect to go to jail instead. If I had that to do all over again, I personally would do that. I don't think that I can say to a young man that you should go to jail. I think I can say to him that he should question really whether or not there are dichotomies that he will not be able to come to grips with if he does go to Vietnam. I think he must question whether he believes that this country can be wrong at times and whether this country is big enough to correct the mistakes. whether or not he is going to take a part in making this country what it should be, or if he's going to allow it to deteriorate as it is doing now. That's what I would say to him.
That's Sheehan.
I'd like to follow up on something Mr. Kerry mentioned earlier. You said that the war, in your opinion, did not justify the loss of one more American life. But in fact, 53,000 Americans have died in Vietnam. And we're told repeatedly by men inside the government and some out that one of the basic reasons for continuing the war and trying to leave something solid behind in Vietnam is to justify those 53,000 deaths. Now, it seems to me that what you and Mr. Hubbard are proposing is that that the country withdraw from Vietnam, regardless of the consequences to Vietnam itself. And doesn't this make meaningless the sacrifice of those 53,000 lives? What do you have to say about that?
First, that's really a two-part question. Let me answer it as quickly as I can. First of all, I don't say, nor does Mr. Hubbard, we should pull out regardless of the consequences. I think this country has a long obligation in the future for reparations to the Vietnamese. And I think that our pulling out, if we pull out accepting a coalition government without the Chu Ki Kiem regime, which we can do, and which is the only obstacle to our pulling out, would be a realistic representative political force. To answer your question as to the dead, we will have marching with us mothers of prisoners of war, mothers of soldiers who've been killed, wives of husbands who've been killed. We will have Marines coming down here, men with no legs, with Navy crosses, silver stars, purple hearts, 100% disabled, who are coming here to say to the people of this country, we've lost our sons, we've lost our husbands, I lost my legs. But the important thing is not that that happened. Let's not keep killing people to justify my loss. Let's not glorify the dead. Let's try and glorify the living. Let's do something for the living. And they would say, therefore, don't let it happen to any more people when it doesn't have to. Don't let it happen to someone else.
Gentlemen, we have less than 3 minutes. Mr. Kerry, I'd like to ask you this question. The three leading veterans organizations, I understand, who have endorsed the objectives of the war in Vietnam, have enrolled a total of over 500,000 Vietnam servicemen as members. Now, how significant are the 12,000 that you say you have?
I think the 12,000 is very significant for a number of reasons. First of all, many of the men who come back are hustled straight into the veterans organizations. Secondly, we do not get the lists from the Defense Department in order to write them, find out where they are and who they are. The other organizations do. We've tried to sue the department for it, and we've lost. Thirdly, we do not operate with the kind of budget that we can reach out to these people. And fourthly, the men who come back from Vietnam, this is really what we're coming down here to say. The men who come back have changed. They're alienated. They've gone to Vietnam and they fought for something, and they've come back to this country to find 22% of them unemployed, to find a waiting time for drug addiction in the hospitals, to find that there are only 20 beds allocated in some hospitals, to find that it takes them 9 months to get artificial limbs if they need them. And so I think the important thing is that we have a new kind of veteran. And I don't think, if you consider that there are 2.5 million and only 500,000 or so have joined, I think that's very, very small. I think you have to look at it the other way.
We have less than 2 minutes now. Mr. Hubbard, did you want to say something on that?
I'd like to add something to that. I don't know that figure you gave of 500,000 is accurately presented, because I do know that in the VA hospitals that there are a great many veterans who sign up with the VFW, American Legion, disabled veterans, for the express purpose of having someone to assist in the adjudication of their particular cases, and they do not relate to the organizations beyond that. So I think that distinction should be made, and I don't think it has in that figure.
We have less than 1 minute now. Mr. Goralski.
One of the manifestations of all the anti-war activity is that we wonder about the future of the military. Do you foresee a large military force, or are you just plain anti-military?
I don't think it's I think the military needs great, great changes in this country, obviously. And I think that one doesn't have to necessarily say that we're not for defending this country. One doesn't have to say that the defense of the country will be hurt by the fact that we're opposing this war. But there are changes that need to be made.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but our time is up. Thank you, Mr. Hubbard and Mr. Kerry, for being with us today on Meet the Press. I'll tell you about next week's guests in just a minute after this message.
Allstate Insurance Company, Northbrook, Illinois. He'll send you the free booklet,
Let's make driving a good thing again.
For a printed copy of today's interview, send 10 cents in coin and a stamped, self-addressed envelope to Merkel Press, Box 2111, Washington, D.C. 20013.
Next Sunday on Meet the Press, our guests will be two leading authorities on China and East Asia, Dr. John K. Fairbank and Professor Jerome A. Cohen, both of Harvard University. Now, this is Lawrence Spivak saying goodbye for Al Hubbard, John Kerry, and Meet the Press.
Today's edition of Meet the Press was brought to you by Allstate Insurance Companies. For insurance to protect your car, your home, your life, health, and business, too, talk to the good hands people. David Copperfield is the Charles Dickens classic of the happy as well as tragic event that shaped the life of a boy as he matures into manhood. Join an all-star English cast as NBC brings the story to life once more in the encore performance of David Copperfield, Wednesday evening at 9, 8 Central Time, right here on NBC. This is Lee Dayton speaking. Meet the Press has been a public affairs presentation of NBC News and has come to you live from our studios in Washington, D.C.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.